It was a warm afternoon, and the park was bustling with people. Children were playing, families were picnicking, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter. Among all the activity, Mrs. Harris, an elderly woman in her 70s, sat quietly on a bench under a large oak tree, watching the world around her. She had always loved this park, a place where she could sit and enjoy the peacefulness, even if just for a few hours. That day, however, things were different. Mrs. Harris had been feeling a little under the weather lately, but she still insisted on coming to the park. As she sat there, she suddenly began to feel the all-too-familiar tightness in her chest. Her breath became shallow, and she started to panic. She knew exactly what was happening. An asthma attack. Her hands trembled as she reached for her bag, fumbling through it, searching for her inhaler. It was a lifesaver, something she carried with her at all times. But as she reached into her bag, the inhaler was nowhere to be found. Panic set in even more as she tried to breathe deeply, but her lungs felt constricted. With each breath, her anxiety grew. She needed her inhaler, and she needed it fast. Desperately, she looked around, hoping for someone to notice her distress. That's when Officer Thompson, a local police officer, spotted her. He was patrolling the area, keeping an eye on the people in the park, ensuring everything was in order. As he approached, he saw Mrs. Harris struggling. However, rather than offering help, he assumed something was wrong. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Officer Thompson asked, approaching her with suspicion. His tone was firm, as if he was questioning her actions, not realizing the true urgency of the situation. Mrs. Harris tried to speak, but her words came out as gasps. I can't breathe. My inhaler," she managed to say, her hand reaching out to him weakly. But Officer Thompson, not fully understanding the situation, looked down at her with a puzzled expression. To him, it seemed like she was making a fuss over something minor. "What's going on here?" Officer Thompson asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed her hand reaching toward her bag. He wasn't sure what was happening, but his mind went straight to suspicion. "I need my inhaler, please," Mrs. Harris repeated, her voice strained, but the officer didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation. He saw an older woman sitting on a park bench, not acting in the usual manner, and he immediately assumed she might be causing trouble. Before Mrs. Harris could say anything more, Officer Thompson took the inhaler from her bag and, without even asking, held it out of her reach. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, now confused about the situation. "Are you trying to get into something you shouldn't be doing?" Mrs. Harris was too weak to explain herself, and all she could do was try to reach for the inhaler. But Officer Thompson still didn't seem to understand that she was in medical distress. He simply stood there, holding the inhaler out of her reach. Her breath grew more erratic, and her hands began to shake. "Please," she gasped, unable to do much more than beg. She was scared now. Her chest felt tight, and she couldn't breathe. Her vision began to blur. She was desperate, but instead of helping, Officer Thompson remained still, watching her. The confusion and tension in the air was growing thicker by the second. Mrs. Harris was beginning to feel like she might not make it. Her body was growing weaker with each passing second, but the officer was still standing there, unaware of how serious the situation had become. The people around them began to notice, some looking on with concern, but it was too late for any of them to help. The officer, now aware of the tension, finally moved to hand her the inhaler, but it was clear that Mrs. Harris was in trouble. What happened next would change everything for the officer, but he had no idea what was coming. As Officer Thompson handed the inhaler to Mrs. Harris, she struggled to catch her breath. She was shaking, her vision blurry, and her heart was racing. Slowly, with trembling hands, she managed to bring the inhaler to her mouth and pressed the nozzle. A small puff of medicine entered her lungs, and she inhaled deeply. For a brief moment, she felt a slight relief, but she still wasn't fully out of danger. Officer Thompson, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, took a step back, but he still didn't fully understand the gravity of what had just occurred. He watched Mrs. Harris, trying to catch her breath, still recovering from the asthma attack. He looked over at the crowd that had started to gather around, some people showing concern, others just watching with curiosity. As Mrs. Harris took another deep breath, she finally began to stabilize, though her hands were still shaking. She felt weak, but at least she could breathe a little better now. Still, she was angry, not just at the officer for not recognizing the situation sooner, but at herself for being so vulnerable in the first place. But just as she thought she could finally catch her breath, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Mom. The voice was clear and filled with concern. Mrs. Harris turned her head, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw who it was. It was her son, Marcus. He was running toward her, his face full of worry. She had no idea how he had arrived so quickly, but she could feel the relief wash over her as he reached her side. His presence, the sight of him, made her feel safer. Mom, are you okay? Marcus asked urgently, kneeling beside her. He looked up at Officer Thompson, his eyes full of both confusion and anger. What happened here? He asked, his voice firm, though calm. The officer, realizing the gravity of the situation now, stood still, watching as Marcus crouched down to help his mother. He had never seen someone so concerned, so determined to help another. It was a feeling that seemed foreign to him, something that had shifted in the moment. Just an asthma attack, Mrs. Harris managed to say, her voice a little stronger now. She was still shaky but grateful that her son had arrived. I just couldn't breathe. He didn't understand, but I'm fine now. Marcus, relieved that his mother was recovering, still shot a look at the officer. He could tell there was something not right about the situation. He had been walking through the park when he noticed people gathering around his mother. His heart had skipped a beat when he saw her struggling, but it wasn't until he got closer that he saw the officer standing over her. Without hesitation, Marcus stood up and turned toward Officer Thompson. I don't know what you were thinking, he said calmly, but this is my mother, and she could have been seriously hurt. You can't treat people like this. His tone had shifted from concern for his mother to frustration with the officer's behavior. Officer Thompson stood frozen for a moment, not knowing how to respond. He hadn't meant any harm, but he knew he had misjudged the situation. He was too quick to act without understanding what was really going on. That's when Marcus added, You're lucky my mother is okay, but this isn't just about her asthma. It's about treating people with respect. You don't know who people are, and you sure don't know who they're connected to. The officer's eyes widened. He had never heard those words spoken so directly, especially not about him. But before he could respond, Marcus continued, My father's the head of the hospital's emergency response team. You don't want to make this mistake again. The officer's face went pale as the word sunk in. He had no idea who Marcus was or the connections he held, but in that moment, he realized how badly he had mishandled the situation. Marcus turned to help his mother stand up, offering her his arm for support. As he did so, Officer Thompson stayed silent, watching as the moment turned into a revelation he would never forget. He had underestimated the situation, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. The officer had not only disrespected an elderly woman in distress, but had also underestimated the power of connections and the importance of understanding one's role in the world. Officer Thompson stood frozen as Marcus helped his mother to her feet. The tension in the air was thick, and the onlookers could sense something was changing. What had started as a simple misunderstanding now seemed much more complicated. The officer's hand trembled slightly, a mix of guilt and realization sinking in. As Marcus supported his mother, who was still catching her breath, he turned back to the officer. His face had softened, but his eyes remained serious. You could have killed her, he said quietly, but the weight of the words made the officer wince. You didn't even think to ask if she had a medical condition. All you saw was a black woman, and you treated her like she was invisible. The words hit Officer Thompson harder than he expected. He was a trained officer. He had been taught to assess situations, to act swiftly and with authority. But in that moment, his training had failed him. He hadn't looked closely enough at the details. He hadn't listened. And worst of all, he hadn't seen the person in front of him as more than just someone to control. Marcus, sensing the officer's discomfort, took a deep breath before speaking again. You need to learn how to treat people with respect. No one deserves to feel like their life is in danger, especially not because of someone's ignorance. The officer nodded, though the words felt heavy. He had thought his position as a law enforcement officer gave him power over people. He hadn't realized until now how important it was to treat people with humanity, no matter their background. As Marcus helped his mother toward a nearby bench, Officer Thompson took a step forward. His voice was softer now. "I am sorry," he said. The apology felt foreign, but it was necessary. "I should have handled this differently. I didn't mean to hurt her." Mrs. Harris, now sitting on the bench, looked at the officer. She was still shaken, but the worst of her asthma attack had passed. She took a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the officer. "You didn't just hurt me," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "You almost took my life. It's more than an apology. It's about respect. It's about understanding what people go through and not making assumptions." The officer shifted uncomfortably. He had always believed that his job was about upholding justice, about maintaining control. He hadn't realized how often that control came at the expense of the very people he was sworn to protect. Now, in this moment, he saw how dangerous that mindset could be. The crowd around them, which had been silent until then, began to murmur among themselves. Some were nodding in agreement with Mrs. Harris, while others were simply watching in disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. It wasn't every day that an officer admitted a mistake so openly, especially in front of so many witnesses. Marcus, noticing the change in the crowd's energy, took another step forward. He was proud of how his mother was handling the situation. Her strength and dignity in the face of adversity made him proud to call her his mother. "You should get your act together," Marcus added, his voice steady but firm. "People's lives are at stake, and you can't just go around making assumptions about people. Do you understand?" Officer Thompson stood silent for a moment, contemplating Marcus's words. He nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll make sure I do better. I won't make the same mistake again." The tension in the air began to ease as the officer's sincerity became evident. It wasn't just an apology, it was a promise. A promise that, moving forward, he would treat every person he encountered with the dignity they deserved. As Marcus and Mrs. Harris left the scene, the officer watched them go, still deep in thought. He knew that the road to rebuilding trust wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that this was a step in the right direction. One that could help change not only how he viewed others, but how he acted as a representative of the law. And in that moment, Officer Thompson realized that the true strength of his role as an officer wasn't in the badge or the uniform. It was in how he treated the people he swore to protect. The days following the incident were filled with reflection for Officer Thompson. He found himself replaying the events in his mind, each moment standing out more than the last. He had been taught to react quickly, to control the situation, but he hadn't stopped to think about the people involved, especially Mrs. Harris. The realization was hard to accept, but necessary. His actions had been based on assumptions, not understanding. The next day, Officer Thompson went into work with a different mindset. His usual confidence was replaced with a sense of humility. He walked through the police station, nodding at his colleagues, but something had changed. He could feel it in his every step. His interaction with Mrs. Harris had shaken him to his core, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about his job. His partner, Officer Garcia, noticed the change in him. She was used to Thompson's usual assertiveness, but today he seemed quieter, more reflective. She approached him at their desks, her tone casual but concerned. "Hey, you okay? You seem off today." Officer Thompson took a deep breath before replying. "I messed up yesterday. I acted before thinking, and I put someone's life at risk." Garcia raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? You're a good cop, Thompson. You've been through the academy. You've been in tough situations. We all make mistakes. But Officer Thompson shook his head. This wasn't just a mistake. I assumed things about Mrs. Harris based on her appearance, and I didn't even stop to ask if she had a medical condition. I didn't treat her like a person first. I treated her like a problem. Garcia stood in silence for a moment, processing what her partner had said. She knew Thompson to be a good officer, but this was different. She could see that something had shifted in him. You're right, she said quietly. We don't always see people for who they are, just for what we think they are. And that can make all the difference. The conversation lingered in the air, but Officer Thompson didn't let it distract him. He knew that talking about his mistake was one thing. Now, it was time to make things right. He had to show that he was willing to change, not just to Mrs. Harris, but to himself as well. Later that afternoon, Officer Thompson found himself standing in front of the same park where he had confronted Mrs. Harris. It felt surreal to be back, but he knew this was the first step toward redemption. As he walked past the same spot where the incident had occurred, he saw the bench where Mrs. Harris had sat, still unoccupied. He glanced around, unsure if she would return. To his surprise, he spotted a familiar face, a young man standing a few steps away from the bench. It was Marcus, Mrs. Harris's son. He recognized the officer immediately, but didn't seem angry. Instead, he looked more like someone who had something to say. Thompson hesitated before walking over to him. Hey, Marcus, Officer Thompson began, his voice quieter than usual. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything. I acted without thinking yesterday, and I put your mom in a dangerous situation. I'm truly sorry for what happened. Marcus looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he smiled. I appreciate that, he said, his voice calm. It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. But you need to know that it's not just about an apology. It's about change. People deserve to be treated with respect, no matter what. Thompson nodded, understanding the weight of his words. I get it. I'm learning, Marcus. I'm going to do better. Marcus gave him a small nod of approval. I hope so. It's not about making things right in an instant. It's about showing that you've changed. As the two men stood there, a sense of understanding passed between them. Officer Thompson realized that this moment wasn't just about apologizing. It was about becoming a better officer, one who treated people as individuals, not as stereotypes. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was on the path to making things right. It was a small step, but it was the first step toward earning back the trust that had been lost. And that was the most important part of being a police officer. It wasn't about power, it was about service. The next morning, Officer Thompson could not shake off the feeling of guilt that had weighed on him. He sat at his desk, staring at the piles of paperwork before him. The usual tasks seemed trivial now. The only thing on his mind was Mrs. Harris and the way he had treated her. He couldn't believe that he had allowed his assumptions to get in the way of his job, his duty to protect and serve. At lunch, Officer Garcia approached him once again. You okay, Thompson? She asked, her voice calm and concerned. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. I don't know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about what happened. I treated Mrs. Harris horribly, and I can't stop thinking about how much I've let her down. I didn't just put her in danger, I showed her no respect. Garcia sat down beside him. It's good that you're reflecting, but don't be too hard on yourself. We all make mistakes, especially in tough situations, but what matters is that you want to make it right. Thompson looked up at his partner, grateful for her understanding. I don't just want to apologize, though. I need to change. I need to be a better officer, not just in how I respond to people, but in how I think about them. Garcia gave him a supportive smile. That's the right attitude. Change takes time, but it starts with wanting to do better. And from what I know about you, you've got it in you. Later that day, Officer Thompson made a decision. He knew that an apology wasn't enough. He needed to show Mrs. Harris that he had changed. But he also realized that he couldn't just apologize to her. He needed to show the community that he was learning, that he was growing into a better version of himself. So, after work, he drove to Mrs. Harris's neighborhood. He wasn't sure if she would be home, or even if she would want to speak to him, but he had to try. As he pulled up to her house, he saw her sitting on the porch, enjoying the afternoon sun. Her son Marcus was beside her, laughing as they talked. Thompson hesitated before getting out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew he had to face her. As he walked up the steps to the porch, Marcus stood up and looked at him warily. "Marcus," Officer Thompson said, his voice steady but respectful. "I've come to speak to your mom. I need to apologize again. I know I can't change what happened, but I want to make it right." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "I respect that you're here, Thompson, but she needs to hear it from you." Mrs. Harris looked up as Officer Thompson approached her. She didn't seem angry or upset, just tired. When she saw him, her face softened, and she slowly stood up from her chair. "Mrs. Harris," Thompson began, his voice sincere, "I'm truly sorry for what happened the other day. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you, and I should have treated you with the respect you deserve. You didn't deserve what I did." Mrs. Harris looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Thompson, but it's not just words that matter, it's what you do next." Thompson nodded. "I understand. I'm working on being better. I won't make the same mistake again." She gave a small nod, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked in a shared understanding. It was the first time that Thompson felt as though he was truly seeing her, not as a person to control or subdue, but as a human being with her own life and struggles. As he turned to leave, Marcus called out to him, "It's not easy, you know, changing how we see the world, but you're on the right path." Thompson smiled at him. "Thanks, Marcus. I know I have a long way to go, but I'll keep trying." Walking away from their home, Officer Thompson felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had apologized. But more importantly, he had promised to change, not just in how he handled situations, but in how he viewed the people he served. He knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning he was proud of. Change would take time, but he was determined to earn the trust of his community, one step at a time. The next few days were difficult for Officer Thompson. Every time he walked into the precinct, the memory of how he had treated Mrs. Harris haunted him. He tried to keep his focus on his duties, but every arrest, every call, reminded him of the decision he had made to change. In the evenings, after his shifts, he would sit quietly in his apartment, reflecting on how far he had come, but also on how far he still had to go. He started reading books on empathy, diversity, and police reform. He watched videos, listened to podcasts, and even attended community meetings to learn more about the people he served. Despite the challenges, he felt a spark of hope, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. He was determined to be a better officer, not just on the job, but in every interaction. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew he had to keep going. One afternoon, as he was working a traffic stop, he saw something that made him pause. A young girl, no older than 10, was walking down the sidewalk near the stop. She was carrying a large bag, and she was looking around nervously, clearly lost. Officer Thompson watched as she tried to hail a car, but no one stopped. Without thinking, he pulled over, parked his car, and got out. He walked over to the girl, who looked up at him with wide eyes. She seemed a little scared, but she didn't back away. "Hey there," Thompson said in a calm voice. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm looking for my mom," she said quietly. "I got separated from her, and I don't know where she went." Thompson kneeled down to her level. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'll help you find her. We'll figure this out together." He took out his radio and called for backup, explaining the situation. Then he gently walked beside the girl as they made their way down the street. A few minutes later, an officer arrived and took over, while Officer Thompson stayed with the girl. As they continued walking, the little girl looked up at him with a shy smile. "You're really nice," she said. Thompson smiled back. "Thank you. I'm just trying to do the right thing." Soon after, they found the girl's mother, who was searching frantically nearby. The reunion was emotional, and the mother thanked Officer Thompson over and over. "Thank you so much for helping my daughter," she said, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you." As Thompson watched the mother and daughter walk away together, he felt a wave of pride wash over him. It wasn't just about doing his job. It was about making a real difference in people's lives. The next day, as he entered the precinct, his sergeant called him into his office. Officer Thompson had been expecting this moment. He had made a lot of mistakes in the past, and he wondered if his recent efforts would be enough to make things right. To his surprise, the sergeant smiled and said, "Thompson, I've noticed a change in you. You've been working harder, being more patient with people. I think you've learned a lot from the mistakes you made. Keep it up." Thompson felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. He knew that he was still a work in progress, but hearing those words meant more than he could express. The journey he had started was far from over, but he was on the right path. That night, as he sat in his apartment, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. He remembered the day when he had wronged Mrs. Harris. He remembered how ashamed he felt. But now, he could finally see a way forward. He was learning to see people as individuals, not as problems to be solved. For the first time in a long while, Officer Thompson allowed himself to believe that change was possible, not just for him, but for the entire community he served. The road ahead was still long, and there would be challenges along the way. But Officer Thompson knew that with every small step, he was becoming the officer he had always wanted to be. Weeks passed, and Officer Thompson continued to dedicate himself to making things right. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. He had become a better officer, and even more importantly, he had started to understand the people he was serving in a way he never had before. The once strict, rule-bound officer had transformed into someone who truly cared about making the community better. One afternoon, as he was working on a routine patrol, he received a call that brought him to a local park. A woman had been reported feeling unwell and was sitting on a bench, looking exhausted. When Officer Thompson arrived at the park, he immediately saw her sitting there. She looked like she was in her late 30s, and she was holding her stomach with one hand, her face pale. He quickly approached her. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice calm. The woman looked up at him, clearly in distress. "I don't feel so good. I think I might be having a panic attack," she explained, trying to catch her breath. Officer Thompson knelt down in front of her, keeping his distance but showing concern. "It's okay," he said softly. "Take deep breaths. Let's just focus on getting you the help you need. Can I call someone for you?" The woman shook her head slightly. "I don't have anyone nearby. I'm alone." Officer Thompson, thinking quickly, called for an ambulance to come to the park. He stayed with the woman, ensuring she was as comfortable as possible while they waited. His mind wandered back to the lessons he had learned over the past few weeks. The power of understanding, of taking the time to listen, was something he had overlooked for too long. "You're going to be fine," he said reassuringly. "The ambulance will be here soon." As they waited, the woman's breathing began to slow. Her eyes filled with gratitude as she looked up at him. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling. Thompson nodded, offering a small smile. "No problem. I'm just doing my job." After a few minutes, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics quickly assessed the situation and took the woman to the hospital to ensure everything was okay. Officer Thompson watched as the ambulance drove away, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It was moments like these that made the job feel truly rewarding. Later that week, Officer Thompson received a call to meet with his sergeant. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he entered the office, He was surprised by the words of praise. "Thompson," his sergeant began with a smile, "I've been hearing good things about you. Your recent work has been outstanding. I've seen you go above and beyond to serve the community. It's clear that you've learned a lot over these last few months." Officer Thompson felt a rush of relief wash over him. His hard work, his efforts to change, had finally paid off. He wasn't the same person he had been when he made those mistakes with Mrs. Harris. He had grown, and he had made real changes. "Thank you, sir," Thompson said, his voice full of sincerity. "I've been trying my best. It hasn't always been easy, but I'm learning every day." His sergeant nodded. "Keep it up. You're becoming a better officer and a better person, and that's what matters most." As Officer Thompson left the precinct, he thought about everything that had happened. He had started this journey with a single mistake, but now he had come full circle. He was making a difference, not just in his work, but in his understanding of people. He had learned the power of listening, the importance of empathy, and how these things could truly transform a community. That night, as he sat at home, reflecting on the day, Officer Thompson realized something powerful. The true meaning of his work wasn't in the badges or the uniforms. It was in the lives he touched, the people he helped, and the respect he earned from his community. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to continue making a positive impact. He was ready for it.